Thank you. Thank you for having me. And welcome to everybody who's joining us online. I am Erin Gabriel, better known as Colin, Bridget, and Abby's mom. I am the Director of Advocacy for Little Lobbyists. I am also the state chapter leader for Little Lobbyist Pennsylvania, as was mentioned. We are a family-led organization. We are advocating for the healthcare and special education and inclusion, community inclusion that our children with complex medical needs and disabilities need to survive and thrive. We are very grassroots, and we generally go into DC or into Harrisburg here in Pennsylvania, and we share our family stories with legislators. We believe that our stories have the power to change minds and move legislation. And so we share our own stories, we let our children share their stories, and we also carry with us the stories of other families from across the country who cannot make it to DC on a regular basis or at all. And those stories have proven to be very powerful. I'm going to share a little video with you guys as everybody's kind of getting settled in and getting themselves cozy, and then we can talk a little bit about how to share your story and be effective at it. So that was just a little bit about the work we've been doing. You might hear some rustling and some noises in the background because, as the video pointed out, we are all real families, and I am here with my kids and my dogs, and they're all making snacks. So to start with, before you start advocating with your children and with your family, it's very, very important that the first thing you do is you sit down with your kids and you really consider how you and your child feel about being public. It's not for everybody. There's no harm or shame in not wanting to share your story. That can be a very personal decision. It's also very important that you check with your child, and if your child cannot communicate with you, that you really consider how they might feel about you sharing their story. If you're able to talk to them about it, talk to them about it. Explain to them what's involved in a kid-friendly way, and make sure that they're okay with it. And if they can't talk, my rule of thumb is I think about my preteens and how I would feel if, oh my goodness, my mom shared that on social media or with a senator or on the news. So really consider what parts of your story and what parts of your family's story you are going to share, and how your kid might feel about that when they read it when they're older. It is perfectly fine to keep parts of your story private, and there is a lot of power in just sharing your story, any part of it that you feel comfortable with. But most importantly, we have to respect our kids and make sure that they're comfortable with what we're sharing about them. When you are telling your story, it's important to think about why it is relevant to what you're going to speak about. Typically, when you go in to meet with a legislator, you have an agenda, you have a reason to be meeting with them. For us, it has been to save healthcare. Frankly, the reason that our organization was formed was to protect the Affordable Care Act from the threats of repeal and replace in 2017. And as we've moved forward, our goal has been to protect healthcare and to advance disability rights for not just our own kids, but for all kids. This is a picture of me speaking, I'm going to say it was 2018, the summer of 2018, when there were protests across the country about immigrant children being separated at the border. And one of the things that was happening to these children at the border as they were being separated is they were also being separated from healthcare. There was a story of a little boy who had crossed the border and he had epilepsy. And for whatever reason, the immigration police took his medicine from him, and he was without his epilepsy medicine for 4 days. So my daughter, who's pictured here, that's Abby, also has epilepsy. And I went into my congressman and I went into multiple other senators and legislators with other families. And the part of my story that I told is my daughter has epilepsy, and I know what it does to her when she's without her medication for 4 days, and it's not a safe situation. And so when you can put a face, even if it's not the face of that actual child at the border, but the face of a child sitting in front of them that's representative of that story, that can actually be very, very effective. And it did move my congressman and several others to take action. If there is a piece of legislation that you're particularly interested in, having the bill number, the current bill number with you, is also really just streamlines the situation. It makes it easier for staffers. And get used to saying things like families like mine. Because you're not just advocating for your own child, and you are advocating for your own child, but you're not just advocating for your own child. And there is power in numbers. So if you can say it's not just my family that this affects, it affects this many other families across our district, that really does get their attention, and it can be quite effective. The most important thing, besides being okay, having your child be okay with you sharing, is to be yourself. Absolutely, your story matters, and we believe in the power of stories to change hearts and minds. And being yourself and being authentic is hugely important. You do not have to be an expert. Please don't ever think you have to be an expert on anything besides your own story. In fact, it's best, it maintains better credibility if you don't embellish, don't exaggerate your story, don't go into big details that you don't actually understand or unsure about. It's okay to say, I don't know. And they can find the answer on their own. They don't need to have all the answers from you. But you are sharing your story and putting a face on the issue that you're discussing. It's very important to help everyone get to know and love your child. So the first thing that we do when we're talking about our kids is we talk about our kids. We talk about them as children first. This is my daughter, Abigail, and she is sitting here playing with her Congressman Connor Lamb. We're from Western Pennsylvania. And he knows her as a kid, as one of his constituents. And I always make sure that I bring that up first. Abby loves Disney. She loves all things musical. She loves going to the theater. She loves playing outside with her big brother and sister. She loves her swings. She loves going for rides in the car and putting her hands out the window. She loves Disney on Ice. She just loves to be out in her community, and she loves to be a kid. And I always make sure that I share that first before I start talking about her medical challenges and her disabilities, because making your child human is a huge aspect of telling their story. If you can, if you're comfortable, bringing your child in with you is completely okay and even encouraged. Again, it helps them to be able to advocate for themselves, to bear witness to you advocating for them. And it helps the legislators to get to know exactly who their policies are going to affect. I know and under several circumstances, my congressman has actually called me up and said, I'm looking at this piece of legislation and I'm wondering how it will affect Abby. And that's a huge thing. I mean, that's just an enormous thing. And, you know, there's my little girl sitting behind a congressman's desk in Washington, D.C., because we've shared her as a human being and not just a statistic. The words that you use matter. We really try very hard to avoid using any terms that put disability in a negative light. We use the term disabled instead of special needs. Special needs doesn't imply all the protections of disability. And the needs that our kids have are simply, they're not special. The need to access a building is not special. The need to be able to eat the right kinds of foods is not special. The need to communicate is not special. These are just basic needs. So we think it's very important that we use the word disabled. And we look to the disability community, the adult disability community, for guidance frequently. And, you know, we all make mistakes. I've made mistakes, and it's okay to make those mistakes as long as you learn from them and you move on. We think it's very important that our children are going to grow up to be part of the larger disability community. And we would like to raise them in that way so that we are very respectful and so that they have a community to grow into. And that's been a huge assistance to us, actually, because we've been able to partner with other disability organizations, and that makes our message more powerful as well. If you have questions about language, I often refer people to the Disability Language Style Guide for further guidance. You can find a link to that on our website. Let's see. And keep things simple. A lot of our kids have very involved medical equipment and procedures and things like a tracheotomy. We would say a tube that helps them breathe instead of the big medical terms, because not everybody understands all those terms. So making sure that you kind of keep your language simple so that a kid could explain it. This is my middle daughter, Bridget. She is 13 now. I'm trying to think. I think she was 11 in this picture. And she is sharing with Senator Casey a picture that she drew that describes what she thinks the Disability Integration Act would do for our family. And being able to communicate something on that level to a legislator is really very, very helpful. It helps them to see it in a whole new light, and it helps them to understand it better without it being too complex. The same thing goes for insurance and other, special ed terms as well. A lot of us speak in acronyms when we're talking about IEPs and all that. But if you can actually avoid the abbreviations with people, that really does help. If you're not sure if you're speaking clearly and you're not sure if you're making a lot of sense, ask a friend. Ask a friend who knows nothing about what you're talking about and see if they understood what you said. Now, when we go in and advocate, we have 3 different types of in-person events we typically do. Obviously with COVID, that's kind of all been turned on its head, but I'm going to talk about them anyway, because I'm hoping that someday we'll be able to get back to these in-person events. We do a lot of office visits, and we do rallies and press conferences. With office visits, we take that opportunity. It's usually an appointment, but if you're in the area, they don't lock the doors. You can knock on the door and walk right in and see if somebody has time to chat with you. But it's always best if you can get an appointment, because then they can get you in with the right person. We share our stories with legislators, and we build relationships. We always go in with a top priority, something that we're going to discuss, something that's, we're seeking the legislators' assistance with. And we do often bring leave behinds. You don't have to do this. This is kind of a homework thing for some people. But it's really helpful just to keep yourself organized. It's like a list of bullet points of things that you want to discuss. But if you can make it so that you can leave it behind with the staffer, that way if there was something you didn't get to, at least it's on the leave behind. And it also helps them to kind of put it with their notes and remember the meeting a little bit better. Do make sure that if you are talking about specific legislation, if you have the bill numbers, that helps. And make sure that you take pictures with your own cameras. One congressman once told us not to let a legislator take a picture with you if they weren't going to do something for you. And I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that particular line of reasoning, but it does make a lot of sense. You want to make sure that the pictures that you take are with your own camera so that you have control over that media, unless it's specifically with a legislator that you trust and that you know who will use it in a healthy way. And I hate to have to say that, but it's happened. Let's see. Often we end up meeting people in hallways. We meet with legislators and we meet with staff. We meet with staff in their office or out in the hallway, especially if we have a larger group. A lot of times it ends up in a hallway. This photograph is myself and two of my daughters with Senator Chris Murphy. And this was actually after a press conference. We were out in the hallway chatting, and we snapped a picture, which was wonderful. But a lot of our meetings do end up being in hallways, and I know that seems kind of like they're brushing you aside, but some of those are the most effective meetings that we have. So please don't be put off if you get scheduled in a hall or if you get scheduled with a staffer. Many times being scheduled with a staffer is actually a gift. The staffers are specific to whatever issue you're speaking about, so they have a much deeper depth of knowledge on that issue in terms of what their legislator is trying to accomplish. And many times it's the staffers who are writing the legislation. So being in with them can be enormously effective and powerful. A lot of times you'll hear people say to practice your elevator pitch. Do it. Practice your elevator pitch, because more than once I've ended up in an elevator with a legislator who I wasn't expecting to meet with, but I did really want to talk to. So being able to catch them in an elevator and speak to them in 30 seconds is really very helpful. If you do bring a leave behind, same thing, bring extras in case you run into somebody in the hall or in an elevator. It happens more often than you would think. Hallway visits, this is my children, my son and my two daughters. And yes, my daughter is wearing blue hair because this was a Halloween visit. We were doing trick-or-treating. And my youngest daughter is dressed as Rey from Star Wars. We're here with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley in the hall outside of a hearing room because there was a committee hearing going on, and her staffer actually scheduled us between hearings where she had to be in and out of the same room. So we actually had a scheduled meeting with several members of Congress actually during that time in between these meetings. These can be very, very valuable meetings, but the members are busy. So you really do have to be able to speak quickly and think literally on your feet and make sure that your point is being shared efficiently. And again, if you have a leave behind, this is a great time to use it too, because they can kind of stick that in their pocket and take it with them. And if you have your contact information on that leave behind, that's even more helpful, because that way, they can reach out to you if they have questions. Rallies are mostly held outdoors. Usually there's a number of speakers. Oftentimes legislators are speaking at rallies and members of other organizations. We often have Little Lobbyist families speak at rallies. We never ask somebody to speak unprepared. We usually prepare our remarks ahead of time so that you feel confident in what you're saying. There's often cameras present at rallies, so it's very important that you make sure you're okay and your child is okay with being on camera. I know that's an issue for some people, especially if they have different government jobs. But rallies can be a lot of fun. It's a lot of people. They can also be very overwhelming for children with sensory needs, so that's something to take into account as well. They're often outdoors, so you do want to make sure that you're dressing for the weather. In Harrisburg and in DC, DC gets very hot in the summer, but it does actually get pretty chilly in the winter. So in both situations, it's important to dress comfortably and make sure that you are okay with standing outside with your family for a bit. Press conferences are another area that we spend a lot of time on. Usually a member of Congress is giving remarks before a room full of press and cameras and reporters, and they're just trying to get a message out to the public. It might be about legislation, it might be about events. Frequently, a Little Lobbyist is asked to share prepared remarks and tell their story to the press. Again, this is very obviously photographed and video recorded, so you do have to make sure that you are comfortable being in front of cameras and having your story shared potentially nationally. In this photograph, we have Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley with some other legislators discussing the medical deferred action program. This was last fall. We had a situation where the administration was threatening to deport children and adults who were here for medical reasons to receive medical treatment. They were here legally. I just want to make sure I say that right. They were here with all kinds of permission, and they were told to leave within 30 days. So we had many Little Lobbyist families show up just in support. We did not speak at this event, but some of the children who were under threat of deportation did speak at the event. And a lot of times that's what we do. We will just show up in solidarity with other members of the disability community, just to make a point that, you know, we are paying attention and that these families do have our support. And advocacy is very serious work, as I was just saying. It's sometimes very literally life and death, but it's okay to have fun. Senators are people too. It's okay to be creative. We do trick-or-treating. Every October, we take a group of Little Lobbyists dressed up in their Halloween costumes, often in their wheelchairs, and we trick-or-treat around the House and the Senate. We do schedule these with staffers and with senators and members of Congress, so they know we're coming, and they often have treats for us. This is part of building relationships. This is part of the fun. But at the same time, we usually have a list of things that we do want to talk to them about. This is, of course, Senator Casey, our own senator from Pennsylvania, happily handing out Halloween candy to the kids at a conference table in his office. And often I have to kind of sit back and look at, you know, the power of that picture is that you have all these kids with disabilities sitting at a conference table in the Senate. And they have the full attention of the senator, which is pretty amazing. Another thing that we did last year was story time with some members of Congress. We have here Congresswoman Wexton and Congressman Allred, who read our kids' stories. We set up a room in the Library of Congress, and they read us stories. And then afterwards, we met with them and we discussed what our priorities were, what we needed them to help us with. And we actually had several other members of Congress come in and meet with us as well that day. So sometimes offering that fun diversion for members of Congress can kind of, you know, sweeten the deal of getting them to come and listen to you. And again, they get to know your kids as kids. And I can't tell you how powerful that is, because again, when they have a decision to make, they're going to think, how does it affect these families that I know? And I know them as real families. I don't just know them as lobbyists. And again, it's okay to have fun, and make sure you take lots of pictures because, you know, they grow up. We spend a lot of time connecting with other adults with disabilities as allies and mentors and as partners in legislative priorities. Getting to know others doing the same work is invaluable. And these relationships, I think, are especially important for our kids, especially our kids with disabilities. Here is a picture of Julia Bascom, who is an autistic adult. She is the director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And she's posing with my daughter, Bridget, who's also autistic. And they're unplanned, wearing very similar outfits. And they just couldn't be happier to be with each other. And my daughter really looks up to her. And I know I look up to Julia for a lot of advice. I get a lot of advice from other adults with disabilities that are similar to the disabilities that my own children have. And having that perspective is enormously important in this work. So this is the question that, you know, every mom asks a week before they have to go somewhere. What should we wear? And it really does depend on what you're going in to do. If you're going in for an office visit, you do want to dress business attire. I mean, it's a serious business. So, you know, a blazer or a nice blouse if you're a woman, you know, a dress shirt and pants if you're a man. But very important is comfortable shoes. If you are on the Hill in DC, you're going to be walking a lot. Harrisburg, I find you walk a little bit less. The offices are much closer together, but you're still on your feet quite a bit. So comfortable shoes and nice clothes for office visits. Make sure your children are comfortable or they won't be happy. But try to avoid things like jeans and sneakers if you can. Rallies typically tend to be more casual, although some rallies look more like a press conference. So you kind of have to use your judgment there. I tend to err on the side of dressing a little bit nicer because you want to look professional and well-groomed so that legislators will, you know, respect that you're there to do work. If you are bringing kids, please make sure that you bring something to entertain them. This is my daughter, Bridget, sitting with, we had a Little Lobbyist birthday party to celebrate our 2nd anniversary. So we had some swag, which was basically fidget toys for the kids. So she has that out in a suitcase and she's putting it on the table behind her. But making sure that you have fidgets, iPads or tablets for them to watch quietly, snacks, change of clothes if they need it. Anything that you would need for, you know, an outing, you would want to bring with you. And again, this all goes back to building relationships. Multiple visits with the same legislator over time really does start to firm up those relationships, and they do start to really look to you for advice. Keeping in touch with those legislators is super important. Here is my daughter on the left, my daughter Abby. In her wheelchair is sitting with her Congressman Connor Lamb, and she's doing what is her sign of affection is rubbing her wrist against somebody's chin. And they're both smiling at each other. And the second picture is my daughter Abby with Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she's giving her a head hug. But I can't impress upon you enough how important it is to have your kids with you if you can, because a lot of times they make those connections for us. And along the lines of building relationships, it's not just with the legislators. Their staff are often just as important. And those relationships with staff can be so important. They can become friendships, but they can also just provide you with so much information, and they can help you with legislation that you're interested in. This is a picture of my daughter Abby with Senator Casey's disability policy advisor, Michael Gellman McCormick, who, if you are in Pennsylvania and you work in disability or aging at all, you probably know who he is. He's a wonderful man, and he does a lot of work with the community in terms of making sure that legislation is helpful to the disability community. He watches a lot of the legislation, and he helps Senator Casey write a lot of his legislation. And a lot of the policy stuff that goes through that office goes through the staff. The same thing with every other congressman and every other senator. I'm very, I keep in close contact with my congressman's healthcare aide, for example, because she keeps tabs on everything that's going through his office as well. So having a staff meeting instead of a legislator meeting, like I said, can be enormously important. I do remember one time sitting at a table with a staffer who was working on some legislation, and I explained to her, that won't work for my family because, and she looked at me, she says, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. And she crossed it out. And that was with the staffer, that wasn't with the congresswoman. So being able to have those relationships with those staffers and have that trust over time, they can call you when they see something coming across their desk that they think is going to affect you, and vice versa. So it's really important. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that there is often turnover. A lot of staff move around from one senator to another. So it is important to keep in touch with the office to make sure that the person you're talking to still works there. Staffers are often the ones advising on and doing the actual writing. So they need to have a deep understanding of your situation as well. So keeping them in the loop on how legislation is affecting your family is also critically important. And finally, absolutely just keep remembering to have fun. This is one of those things that is a privilege to be able to do. My kids actually enjoy going to DC. I know my daughter doesn't smile in pictures, but she often dances in her wheelchair while we're walking around up there. She really enjoys being there. My older kids keep asking, when do we get to go back? Because we haven't really been able to go since COVID has happened. So these are just some photographs. We have so many photographs of some of the fun things that we've done. Some of the fun people we've met with. In the center is actually a picture of Leader Schumer giving us all Halloween treats inside the Senate, inside the Capitol, which is actually a really cool thing. But again, being able to share your story and your family's story to help people really understand how legislation is going to impact real people like your child. It is really beneficial to the legislators. It gives them a different point of view because they have not lived your life. They don't know how these things impact your family differently than their own. And having that perspective really does help them, not just with the legislation that you're going there to ask them about, but often with other pieces of legislation as well. And building those relationships is really a huge part of advocating, is maintaining those relationships and continuing to do the work. So it's not as scary as it looks. It's actually really fun. In the meantime, but before we can really go back to the in-person stuff, there's plenty that you can do. You can call your legislators and ask them, to support certain legislation. You can write postcards. You can email them. You can show up to virtual town halls, Zoom meetings. But there is one thing that I think is the very most important thing that you can do, is you can vote. And we all know that there is an election coming up. There is actually an election twice a year, every year. There's a primary and a general every year. And being a regular voter gives you power. It gives you the power to decide who is representing your family. And oftentimes I tell people to get involved during the election, get involved with the candidates and the legislators when they're running, when they're in your district, moving around and offering all these meet and greets. Go and meet them. Tell them your story when they're still a candidate, so that they will remember you when they get to Congress, or when they get to the Senate, or when they get to Harrisburg. A lot of the relationships I have built myself have been with candidates, and those candidates later became congresspeople. So I find that is enormously important. These are some older pictures of my daughters and I canvassing for some local candidates. as well as a stack of postcards. I helped organize some postcards in 2018, which is something that was pretty easy to do. I asked people to write the postcards. I connected with campaigns and I got the addresses, and I collected the postcards and we sent them all out the week before the election. Postcarding is enormously popular right now as a means of contacting voters. And it's an easy way for you to get involved and start to feel like you're helping get your chosen candidate elected. So I always say the most important thing that you can do, more important than showing up in DC or Harrisburg, is to vote, to get the right people in there to protect your family.